stable, but also when to put the timer. If it's no further question, I would like to invite the first speaker from the Affirmative team to open the debate.
I'm not sure if this will influence the audio because I'm opening a webcam, but if this like later, can you kindly remind me? Yeah, thank you.
Sure, I will show you this if we will be cutting off. I can just show you if you're looking for the camera, and then I will turn video and you can also decide if that will be better for your connection, okay?
Sure, thank you. Just a sec. Panels. We think the yardstick to judge today's debate is to firstly, why this kind of failure to address the pandemic would be counted as the crimes against humanity, and secondly, which side of the house at the end of the day will actually prevent future pandemic from happening, and also to increase the accountability and provide reparation to all the people who are influenced by that, right? So several things to talk about in my speech. First, I'm going to talk about why this kind of a failure to address the pandemic will actually fit into the crimes against humanity. Secondly, I'm going to give the principal argument about why it is justified for us to do so. And thirdly, I'm going to talk about why it will actually increase accountability. And lastly, I'm going to talk about why the impact of that to provide short-term and also long-term prevention for the future pandemic, right? So firstly, definition. We think that crimes against humanity means that means a systematic attack against the people that causes huge casualty and other kind of influences, right? We think that what we're going to include into this kind of failure to address pandemic that and link that to crimes against humanity is to firstly, we think that there are three characterizations to talk about this kind of issues, right? Firstly, is a hiding of the key information. For example, China to hide this kind of information of COVID-19, and it failed to report it to the WHO. But secondly, we also felt like it is not it failed to act in time and waste of time in other kind of issues. For example, Trump prioritized hold political rally instead of responding to this pandemic and actively rejecting to admit that this kind of issue do exist, right? But lastly, it is also about the issues like counterproductive issues, for example, holding medical resources like PPE to other states in order to respond to the pandemic effectively, right? We think that the scale of this kind of failure can also be put into consideration. It should be large, for example, nationwide, and also impact should be causing massive unemployment and death rate without any kind of responsible or efficient responses coming from the government, right? So firstly, why do we think that it's principally justified for us to sue the government's failure to do so, right? Two layers analysis. Firstly, we think that when government are actively doing this kind of when government fail to do so, it's actually active decision making in order to sacrifice the human lives to other issues, right? We think that it is active. We think that government are actually making active choice in prioritizing other issues. For example, Trump's political rally, than saving a human's life, right? We think that government do have this kind of information about how to give preemption causes in order to save more lives other than other issues, right? But secondly, more importantly, we think it's more like it is also very influential in terms of causing the collateral damage to the entire globe, right? For example, we think that China is rejecting to provide any kind of key information of coronavirus in the early December actually caused a delay in researching and also what kind of measure can be taken into prevention for the global pandemic to happen, right? We think that this kind of collateral damage is influencing the entire world, and that is why it is simply justified for us to sue those kind of national governments. But secondly, why we think that the government should be held accountable for these kind of issues? Firstly, we think that this kind of government are democratically elected, and the people who are suffering from it are actually should be seeking for the accountability and also the justice from the government. But secondly, we also felt like the government has always had the beforehand information about this kind of issue, right? For example, when we have this kind of investigation about how this kind of pandemic actually outbreak in China first, we actually forces WHO to conduct this kind of international level of dialogue between different between among the governments to talk about this kind of issues, right? We think that the government do have the key information about how this kind of coronavirus actually looks like and what kind of measure can be taken into place, and that is why this kind of failure should be taken into consideration. But lastly, as I said before, this kind of global pandemic and also harm imposed on human being is very hard. It means that we are going to see our family and our friends are suffering from this kind of disease without any kind of reasonable response coming from the government, and that is very devastating for the entire human beings, right? But how we're going to solve this kind of issue? We think that we're going to file a lawsuit in the ICC against the national government, and also to have this international pressure. For example, we're going to have media coverage and also to conduct field investigation to establish the domestic investigative committee to find out to gather evidence to find out what is the earliest time for the national government to know about this kind of issue, and when's the earliest time for them to give the response, and whether this kind of response is in time and also effective in general, right? We think that this kind of investigation is more likely to succeed because simply because it is more influential and also inflict the global anger against the national government and force them to take actions for that, right? So what will happen after all these kind of issues, right? And why that will be actually very effective? Firstly, we think that it is going to pressure the national government to provide short-term reparation to the people who are actually being influenced by that, right? For example, in the United States, it is actually going to pressure the national government to respond to the request coming from the people to address the stimulus bill and also provide more reparation to those people, right? And it can also be seen in terms of increasing efficiency in terms of responding to those kind of requests. For example, to fixing the kind of fixing the system of how people can apply to unemployment benefits and also to provide the stimulus check to the people more effectively instead of wasting time on Trump's signature on that, right? But more importantly, we also felt it will be more effective in terms of preemption about outbreak in the future, right? How is that going to happen? Firstly, we think that we're going to incentivize the national government and push them to increase investment in healthcare and education in terms of have more stockhold of the PPE and other medical resources in order to prepare for the next outbreak of the pandemic. But also, we're going to have more investment in terms of technology. For example, to have more investigation on in terms of how the future pandemic will look like and what kind of lesson we can learn from it, and also to put more investment in terms of vaccine and other kind of preemption issues, right? But also, we're going to have this kind of we're also going to increase the transparency in order to hold this kind of national government accountable. How we're going to do so? We're going to establish a standing investigative committees in those kind of countries, and also establish the kind of key epidemiology laboratory in those kind of companies, in those kind of national governments, in order to hold them accountable, and also to help and act as a third-party investigative committee in order to evaluate what kind of issues that national government can do, and also how they're going to respond to that, right? We think that it is all these kind of benefits is mutually exclusive than the other side of the house, because in the status quo, we see that China have more legitimacy in terms of rejecting this kind of request from the WHO and other kind of issues, and we think that only by inciting global anger towards those, and we are going to hold them accountable, and very proud to propose.
Thank you very much for that fine speech. We are ready to call the first speaker from the negative team. Here.
Million.
Can you say something to check if you don't have any background noise?
Yeah, am I audible now?
Yes, all good. Thank you.
Before I move on to my constructives, I would like to clarify two things in my speech. First of all, I think the benefits coming from the affirmative side, okay, I see those kind of benefits actually might exist, but I didn't really see the mechanism through which why all these benefits can actually happen like precisely and uniquely because of their policy, right? I think already those, in my speech, I'm going to tell you as to why already governments actually have a certain level of incentive to actually take care of those issues of pandemic. Secondly, also I think we were very unclear about what exactly is the standard of failure at the first place, right? So I think it is very important because if you look at things in retrospect, if you look at things in hindsight, of course there were a lot of things that you could have done, but in many of the cases, if you are in the situation that you actually have to make a decision right at that moment, you didn't really have access to those information. You might not be able to recognize a certain information or a certain environment was very important and necessary in order for you to make a certain decision at the end of the day. Therefore, I think it is very hard for you to say that this actually is a failure, especially because there actually is something that we can look differently in retrospect and in hindsight. Secondly, we didn't really see any kind of standard as to who is going to judge and how those people actually can be the fairest individuals or the fairest entities who can actually decide that, especially when we be charitable to the affirmative side and assume that the impact of this policy is very big. I think this is extremely important, especially when you don't have a good standard at the first place. Having that said, I'm going to talk about two constructive arguments in my speech. First of all, why the government still has a good intention and why is it bad? Secondly, about the practical impact of this policy. First of all, in the intention. First analysis is that states actually have generally good incentives to solve the problem of pandemic. First of all, I think there is internal domestic checks and balance mechanism because people generally don't like pandemic, right? If economy gets bad because of things like lockdown, people lose job and it is actually very bad for individuals and it actually imposes existential threats. Secondly, also in terms of life, if your family die or if you actually die because of the infection of pandemic, of course it is going to be very bad for you. So I think people are already quite worried of the situation. Therefore, especially when the government is caring about things like re-election, support from the individual and the public, I think there actually is an incentive for the government to take care of this. There actually is an example of Trump who actually wasn't really caring about COVID-19, now is wearing masks and now is actually taking actions to actually solve those kind of problems, right? Secondly, I think especially when we look at in retrospect, I think in cases of MERS and SARS, I think there actually was a lot of countries' effort and international effort to solve and properly deal with those kind of problems at the end of the day, meaning that empirically speaking, there actually has been quite a lot of effort coming from the state. Thirdly, I think there were international criticism that is imposed upon certain countries if they don't do things properly. For example, WHO, as they have mentioned, is actually imposing a certain level of criticism. I think the conclusion of this analysis is that deterrence is already happening right now in the status quo in terms of properly dealing with a pandemic situation. The second analysis about why there are a lot of other factors of failure to deal with those kind of pandemic situations. Three factors. First of all, I think there is lack of knowledge that is inevitably going to happen. Please notice that the pandemic actually is dangerous because it doesn't have vaccine. It is actually very novel and new disease at the first place. So actually, it takes a lot of time to scientifically and precisely know what kind of situation we are in. Those experiments and research actually require things like controlled environment and a lot of time in order for it to actually gain some accuracy. That exactly is the reason as to why we didn't actually know the precise roots of proliferation of COVID-19, even in the status quo. I think there actually is a lack of knowledge. Second thing is about social factors, because there are things like, because if you actually impose a lockdown, it actually causes a lot of harm to the economy, meaning that government also has to take care of those kind of issues as well. Thirdly, I think especially in the context of developing countries where they don't really have much ability and budget to actually construct things like social infrastructure, and they don't really have much ability to provide things like PPE at the first place. I think it's not because the government did not want to, it's because the government did not have proper ability to do so. So I think there are a lot of factors that actually impact the results of dealing with the COVID pandemic situation at the first place. And my conclusion of this argument is saying why this is so bad at the first place, because we think this is principally unjust. I think crime against humanity is an active action to impose a lot of harm to massive public with malicious intent at the first place. The root cause of crime against humanity was because of active action with malicious intent. For example, things like chemical weapons is actually being utilized to kill and harm people and cause them die in a painful way. Right? I think in this debate, pandemic situation is not really different with natural disasters, right? I think so. Even if you put firefighters, even if you put helicopters into certain natural disaster situations, still there are a lot of casualties. Still there can be a lot of people who are being sacrificed. That we don't call that crime against humanity because government actually put a certain level of effort, but government can still fail, right? So I think it is principally unjust. It doesn't really fit in the standard of crime against humanity. My second argument is about practical negative impacts. There are two things. First of all, I think the government is more likely to impose unnecessarily disproportionate policies that doesn't really care about other factors other than dealing with pandemic situation. Because I think there are a lot of costs and trade-offs that we have to deal with in terms of dealing with the pandemic situation. For example, in South Korea, in COVID-19 situation, actually that virus actually was spread in places like gay bar, right? I think people were very angry at those kind of situations and say that, hey, it is because homosexuals are horrible, it's because those people are so bad to the extent that they actually deserve all those kind of criticism at the end of the day. And I think under their side of the house, it is very likely that in those situations, the governments are more likely to open the information of those individuals and try to open the information about like places they were, like places they have went to, and track all those kind of things and try to expose that information to the public so that people can actually be aware of that. But I think it is actually it is very harmful for right to privacy, and especially the right to actually have a safe space and closure at the first place, right? Because it actually imposes active harm to their identity, especially when they are the vulnerable actors who actually are the target of discrimination and all those kind of things, right? So I think things like hate crimes and things like homophobic sentiments, I think those kind of impacts are going to happen under their side of the house. Secondly, I think it is very important to notice that it actually deters active cooperation from the countries, because I think there is less and less incentive for revealing the information to the fullest extent to other countries as well. Because from the moment you actually reveal certain information, and if that is considered as failure, you are going to be largely criticized, and you are going to be like largely condemned of your actions at the end of the day. Therefore, I think things like decreasing the number of casualties and not exposing the information of track of the people who actually got infected. Those kind of things are actually going to happen on their side of the house. I think, for example, when China was suspected, I think, especially in COVID-19 situation, China was actually suspected of concealing the information. I think this is important because even if this happens in a limited number of countries, only in China, let's say, I think it actually imposes a lot of collateral damages, because even if you assume that one country did not reveal the information, it can actually impact other countries in a large extent as well. I think this is a lot of harm to the individuals more than supposed.
Thank you very much for that fine speech. We are ready to call the second speaker from the Affirmative team to continue the debate. Here.
Am I audible?
I think it's fine. If you will be starting cutting, can you try speak something again, like 2 sentences, if we can check if it's stable?
Hi, am I audible?
Yes, I think it's all good. If we'll be cutting off, I will turn down my video. That will be signal that probably better will be without video, okay? Cool.
Thank you. Hannah's negative side basically brought you three things, right? First of all, they say that deterrence already exists, but I will go into debunk that later. And second of all, they say that government is innocent and okay, all this stuff. Okay, first of all, in terms of why they say that deterrent already exists, right? So I presume that they're actually defending the status quo, but I think they really lose the debate if they insist of using this strategy because the status quo is very bad, it's deteriorating, right? Why is it so? First of all, we have to know that pandemic is not something that's frequently happen, and oftentimes the origin country happens in like developing country like Africa, like Ebola in Africa, right? Which means that there's basically lack attention on pandemic before the pandemic happened, right? Which means that no one cares it, it's not in public scrutiny, which means the government doesn't have the incentive to put a lot of resources in it anyway, right? Second of all, we tell that oftentimes government are more likely to focus on like short interest policy like tax deduction, or even like Trump insists of reopen like the state because they know that citizens want it, right? They basically only care about policy that actually can make them get re-elected in the end of the day, which means that politicians do it anyway, which means create the vicious circles of no one caring about the pandemic, which means that in all, the status quo, people deal with pandemic like, reactively, right? Not proactively. But what we are changing here is actually increasing this incentive for government to make prevention of pandemic to happen in the first place. And most importantly, we tell that there are a lot of like government, like China, simply just don't have the incentive to disclose the information when pandemic occurs because government simply don't want to make himself looks bad. Government doesn't want himself to look like a person, a country that creates a lot of mistakes, right? And also, we tell that in status quo, that actually lack the possibility and legitimacy to sue government, right? For example, even if like China actually have actually choose to cover up this information, no countries is able to like legitimately sue China for that. But we tell you that when you actually make this a crimes against humanity, you give this legitimacy for maybe other countries that also being harmed to sue China, to sue like countries that caused this pandemic in the first place. We think that only using this way, you're able to increase the deterrence effect, right? Because previously, you're not able to do so. You only can do everything reactively, right? And then second of all, they say that, oh, sometimes government is just innocent because government don't want pandemic to happen in the first place. Yes, panelists, we don't want pandemic. We also think that government doesn't want pandemic. But what we are trying to tell you is the fact that government constantly neglect pandemic because no one cares about it, which means that it's not the incentive for government to care about it anyway. And second of all, sometimes you just kind of see because the entire argument basically rely on benevolent government, which is not the case. Oftentimes, government just don't give a shit on what happens on its citizens, right? For example, Donald Trump just tell people to drink bleach to cure the pandemic. For example, he insists of reopening the economy, even though a lot of scientists just say don't do it. For example, China just choose to disclose it, choose to cover up this kind of information. So we don't think that I can simply run away from telling you that, oh, government have the innocent, they are actually benevolent, right? Because this is not the case. And second of all, we tell that even if when government lack ability, they say that sometimes government lack the ability to deal with pandemic. We don't think this is the case because oftentimes it's not whether or not they can deal with pandemic, it's whether or not they are willing to make a concession to deal with pandemic. It's about like whether Trump or whether the US prioritize economy over the health of people, right? Whether or not Thailand prioritize the tourism industry over the health of pandemic. Without it, you can see in the COVID-19, you can see like Thailand is willing to actually give up its tourist industry in order to secure its safety of the safety of the citizens, right? How Vietnam has success, how Vietnam, even if we are scarce resources, is able to tackle COVID-19 effectively. So because of its instant response to pandemic. So oftentimes is the government actually able to do it. It's the fact that government simply don't care about it and prioritize other issues over this pandemic, right? Therefore, we think that this is why the failure to address this pandemic is equal to the crime against humanity. So it's how to by equalizing this as crime of humanity, you're gonna get like two benefits, right? First, you're gonna get a short-term incentive for government to deal with, right? It looks like how government are more likely to give like stimulus package to everyone. Note that in status quo, even if stimulus package exists, it only gives like people who are loud, right? Government only give it to like its dominant voters, right? Like how Trump's only gives stimulus package to its evangelical locals instead of like every US citizen, because the government don't have the incentive to help every citizen in the first place. And second of all, we tell that it actually can increase the incentive for government to prevent the pandemic from happening in the first place, which means you actually make the government from reactive to proactive. How we do it? It means the government are more likely to increase like R&D and also increase funding for like medical system, especially like for example, the country like Italy and Spain. The reason why they don't have enough medical system and medical resources to deal with pandemic is simply there's no incentive in the status quo for government to put a lot of money in the medical system, because it is not in the it's not public attention in the first place anyway, right? Without true, when you now tie the government reputation to crime of humanity, this is when they're more likely to care about the reputation. They don't want to be seen like a rogue state. This is when they're more likely to care about all of these people, regardless of these people, whether or not they are the voters anyway, right? And also, without the most important thing is you're able to increase transparency. You bring it to public scrutiny. Now people are very likely to challenge the government whenever they feel like something's dubious, right? Because they know that the government have to answer them instead of saying, oh, nothing happened, right? And the most important thing, you allow the supervision between every country, right? Which means that now US or like any country can simply just send its like troops or maybe like medical teams to like any country that they find is dubious, right? Because in status quo, why you can't do it is because China constantly reject journalists or reject everyone coming in for his country, because it can always say that, oh, this is our domestic issue, right? Because it is because you are just disregarding our national sovereignty, right? Countries always politicize this kind of pandemic to the extent that no one actually able to get the information of it. With how do we change that? When you make it in the crime of humanity, it means that it's irrespective of sovereignty, it's irrespective and independent of politics. It's not just about humanity. It's about human wanting to live. This is when you're more likely to allow like international criminal tribunals setting like medical teams in every country so that they can actually have like cross-pollination of information and supervise of each other, right? Which means that now the pandemic information is no longer bound up within the border, which means that you're more likely to have like transparency and disclose all of this information. Without that, only by actually making this policy to into a public sphere, you're more likely to have public scrutiny. Only by depolitizing this kind of policy, you are able to have a proactive response to this, right? We think that even if we fail in all of these instances, we think that this is a principal argument, right? Why? We think that because that in the status quo, there exists an asymmetric power between citizens and government, right? Which means that even if citizens are dying, are starving, are actually harming from this kind of like failure of government, they simply just have no incentive, no alternative to challenge the government, right? But when you actually tie this to crime of humanity, they can actually challenge the government. You give them moral claim to the government that constantly fail them and ignore them. We think that this is very important, right? And most importantly, with how that when you actually do pandemic, when you actually tie pandemic to a very high level as crime of humanity, this is when people finally care about them. Because in status quo, everyone just say that pandemic doesn't happen frequently. We can deal with that. No, we want people to care about that, look at it, and always deal with it. We think that only this way you can increase check and balance. Because of that, propose.
Thank you very much for that fine speech. We are ready to call the second speaker from the negative team to continue the debate. Here.
Can you hear me?
Yes, very well. All good.
Sorry, just a second. May I begin? Okay, so several things to talk about in my speech. Firstly, I'm going to talk about why government actually does have the incentive to care about what happens to the citizens. And secondly, I'm going to talk about, I'm going to tell you about how their mechanism as to solving the pandemic itself is actually ineffective. And thirdly, I'm going to mechanize how this is rather going to cause more casualties at the end of the day to the world. And lastly, even if this is actually effective, we'll tell you why I like to emphasize the cost of the affirmative side's policy. So firstly, about why the government actually has the incentive to actually care about what happens to the citizens. So firstly, they talk the only example that we hear from the affirmative side about why the government does not have the incentive, always have the incentive to care about the citizens is like firstly talking about giving example about China or giving example about Trump only caring about his political presidential election. However, firstly, our first response is that in case of China, we think China will be hiding a lot more information rather on your side, and that is because China was trying to hide information at the beginning of the outbreak of COVID-19 because at first they thought it wasn't a big deal at the beginning, and we can tell that COVID-19 was a very serious pandemic only with the benefit of hindsight. So in your world, when we actually punish those kind of countries who seem to have failed to address a pandemic, well, as our first negative speaker have mechanized to you, how more countries will be actually hiding more information to actually make themselves seem like they're actually handling it correctly and handling it right, and there's nothing more bad happening in their country. So we think such kinds of harmful example, this kinds of harms will be aggravated rather on your side. And also in case of like Trump, we think now that due to COVID-19, Trump actually lost a whole lot of support from his citizens in the United States. Like even in the United States, like everyone, since everyone has one vote for each person, and now those politicians like Trump also have the incentives now to actually care about everyone else's health and try to deal with pandemic to a very greater degree as well. And not because of the results, because of the consequences they have gone through by not dealing with COVID-19 correctly. So we think we have given you sufficient amount of incentive as to why the government actually do have the incentive to care about what happens to citizens. Firstly, called in terms of economics and also in terms of like political votes, and thirdly because they as human beings we all know that we want to live. And second, and moving on to the second aspect of my speech is about how this is actually the worst condition, how their case is very ineffective in solving this COVID-19 or these kinds of pandemic issues. So they said that they will be pressurizing government to care more about people through this policy. However, our first negative already told you that we already told you that government already have incentives to care about people, and second of all, there's a lot more incentive to care about incentive for countries to hide information because they don't want to be punished by international society, even if we concede to affirmative side that this policy might be effective, and we think the hiding of information leads to is exactly the reason why COVID-19 became such a serious issue. It is because even if only one country like tries to hide their information, it leads to a whole lot of like global pandemic and spreads to other countries and whatnot. So it leads to very serious harm to international society. And thirdly, why this leads to the states becoming a lot more selfish and rather on affirmative side. It is because it is the individual state that will be punished, which means that the states will be only caring about their own citizens, and they will be less incentivized to send out the aid to other countries, like for example, masks and like PPE, like those kinds of examples, the treatment, vaccination, and these kinds of things that the affirmative side offer to us. So because the state boundary of failure to address the pandemic is only limited to their own citizens, we think that it is very likely that for the states to only care about become a lot more selfish. And lastly, because it will lead to it will lead to less and less cooperation in international society. And why is that so? I think we think that international court is weak, international punishment by international court is weak from the beginning to begin with. So if we think that it is only going to lead to a lot more trouble, it is only going to cause a lot more diplomatic conflicts at the end of the day. So with the marquee line that they have in terms of punishing which state actually failed to address the pandemic, we think a lot more troubles will be caused. Like for example, US and China, they will only be blame shifting to each other. Like, you guys did the worst job of handling this pandemic, therefore this is the reason why your people spread more viruses to our citizens, so you guys should be punished and whatnot. Even in the status quo, China is actually diplomatically backfiring to other countries because of their investigating like the viruses or whatnot. And we think these kinds of conditions will be extended to the greater extent in your side of the world, when we can actually blame one particular state for failing to address a pandemic situation. And second of all, in case of developing countries, our first negative speaker already told you about how this is going to worsen in cases of developing countries. And we think that in cases of developing countries, because if they're punished or like if they're criticized for not handling this work, and that was because they were incapable to do so, this will lead to a lot more anti-Western sentiment and anti-international organization sentiment at the end of the day. So this will rather lead to them trying not to reach out for more information or more infrastructure or more resources out from those Western countries or like these international organizations, or less cooperation with WHO and whatnot. So we think that these kinds of conflicts is going to happen to a much greater extent in your side of the world. And what the impact of this is that as the affirmative side also conceded to this fact, COVID-19 and these kinds of health pandemic it should be dealt with international effort, because if everybody does well, but only one country does not cooperate with this, it will still lead to the pandemic situation will still be aggravated to a greater extent. So we need cooperation with everyone around the world. Every country in the world should be trying to handle this situation. However, in your world, because this leads to this punishment of international court becomes a tool for this diplomatic conflict and blame shifting and anti-Western sentiment, we think that countries will be much more disincentivized for diplomatic reasons. And lastly, even if we say that your affirmative side's tool to handle this pandemic actually is very effective, we think that there are the cost that comes from this method is very great to a very high extent. So like for example, anti-terrorism law, when like Five Eyes, those countries try to hack the email sources and try to find out the terrorist plans and plots in order to fight against terrorism. However, this led to a whole lot of global criticism because it was against privacy and because it was against fundamental rights of human beings at the end of the day. So although these kinds of examples were being handled because of the purpose of saving more lives, but in the end it resulted in harming the privacy. And especially in the case of pandemic, we think this leads to a lot more discrimination toward the minority people, like the example of gay bar that our first speaker told you about, and also a lot more less cooperation from people, our citizens, happening in the end. So these are the reasons why we are very proud of this. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that fine speech. We are ready to call the next speaker from the affirmative team to respond. Here.
Okay, please give me a moment.
Sure, you are audible, so you can start with 3 to 1 whenever you will be ready.
Okay. Okay, I will start. Okay. I'll start in 3, 2, 1. So panels, I think that today's debate is decided on two things. So firstly, should the failure to address the pandemic be considered as crime against humanity? And secondly, will this increase state accountability people? And we think this is the two main clashes of today's debate. And I will talk to you about whether our policy, our model is going to be should this our policy should be holding governments accountable, and is this justified to do so? Will it bring positive outcomes? And secondly, if we're going to hold them to bringing them to lawsuits, holding them to going holding a lawsuit, going to the international court, will this shape the narrative? Will it shape the behavior, and will it shape the actions that a government will be taking in the status quo to make things better, right? So before that, I will reveal their case and give rebuttals and refutations to side negative. So firstly, I hear consistently that from their side that they say like government status quo, they have good intentions, right? But they never prove to us why actually exactly that good intentions exist, right? And also how did that a good intention will be put into protecting people, right? But we see Trump, even though he has the good incentive of the people say, oh, you lose job, right? So I'm going to open the economy, right? But they never prove to you how instead instead of let's just simply opening the economy, he will also be asking people to wear masks and not to spread any like anti-Chinese sentiments and to stay having this kind of social distancing, right? So they never prove to you why the government already in its school have this kind of incentive. And we say that our benefits are mutually exclusive because firstly, the domestic civilians, they will suffer from huge power imbalance when the government having this kind of like authority, this power authority having this kind of information to oversee what states are doing good, doing well or badly. But simply they just say, oh, because they have an internal information or just internal like interests, and therefore saying like, oh, you can just do whatever you want, and therefore cannot sue international government and succeed, right? And secondly, we say that existing mechanisms like WHO is kind of failing when we see Trump administration trying to withdraw their fundings to WHO, right? So we see actually WHO at first they already been suffering from the lack of resources and also the media exposure, money, and authority to having that say to enforce all those countries to follow this kind of health guidelines, what the country should prioritize in terms of having in the wake of a pandemic, right? Not economy and not kind of like boosting any kind of like some like monetary gains, but instead care about your people, right? And we say actually good intention doesn't necessarily need to exist, right? So even you have very good intentions, but at the end we just say we just want lives to save here, like all lives matter, right? So that's why they have to prove to us why good intentions will act in their favor, right? So second response. So they say like so small countries simply don't have capability. We say firstly, infestation will only goes to those bigger powers. They say they want to cover up, right? Clear delays, and those small countries will continuously suffer from all these delays. And secondly, all these small countries will still enact issues like we still enact like social distancing that actually we don't need really huge resources, but simply for government to model the way, to model the public's behavior, to say like mask is compulsory. You need to take care of your lives and therefore other people's lives, and then to society life, and then we can move on from this pandemic and to unite and to have a better future, right? So we say that actually the biggest argument is like this is not fair for the government. They can't just have all this kind of responsibility on them when they don't have any capability and any information to do anything, right? We say this is simply not the case. When we all see China having this kind of pandemic, simply countries can say, oh, I'm going to have some like policies like having some quotas or some barriers when you're arriving in my country, right? Having much more like health check or just simply text like that. We say this is the cost is very minimal, but if they don't seem but if governments simply don't prioritize this kind of minimal causes to do this kind of like incremental step, the outcome can be so devastating and detrimental, and that's what we can see in the status quo, and we shouldn't be defending it. And I'm very proud to put out this this proposal. And so first, I want to start with the first thing about why we say this. The first clash, will this kind of criminalizing of this kind of state failure of acting to the pandemic will create positive outcomes, right? So in my rebuttals, I already say actually side negative case doesn't stand at all, because they simply neglected actually governments don't really have the explicit incentive. When we see Trump, when we see China, even if they try to reveal to disclose the information, right? But simply because when they see this kind of information, this kind of scenarios getting worse, and therefore they are forced, they have a accountability to share, to alert people, right? We say we don't want to happen to be having a reactive response from their world, but we say we want proactive response. And actually, our primary concern being also brought up by my second speaker is that when countries can manipulate this kind of event and can perpetuate any kind of mass atrocities, right? When you see, for example, like Qatar or Malaysia, Qatar, that simply governments they trying to politicize this kind of game, saying that, oh, you shouldn't do something. You should, for example, like Trump, like don't wear masks because it's kind of like falling into some people's trap, right? But say first, or even like Modi, like they have some kind of national, they have this kind of like dispute against the territorial area with China, right? But simply we can see this government, because of his nationalistic approach, he tried to unify Indians, their citizens, in the wake of pandemic when their cases are climbing like skyrocketing, right? And we say even he never prioritized the COVID-19 cases of this increasing trend, but instead he kind of intensified the tension, right? Escalate the tension by saying like anti-Chinese sentiments, blocking, bringing down TikTok, and all this kind of tensions, right? We say even if under our side we still have hatred crimes, like all these kind of anti-Chinese sentiments, but we say we still condemn this kind of we shouldn't be wasting our time resources to condemn the blaming others, right? But instead focus on what you can do right now, right? Like simply wash your hands, wear a mask, and simply stay having a distance, right? We say do what you need to do right now. It's very important that we are not saying like you shouldn't be blaming China to be the first original sources, but we say keep this in mind, gather evidence and focus our current outbreak, right? And afterwards, we have this kind of evidence, we can then bring it to court, and then we can sue China for its accountability, to say how can it stay accountable to the whole world, right? So we say that under our side, when we say our citizens to have to fulfill their own responsibility, and therefore we can then say the government can be sued accountable, and government have nothing to hide, cannot push any responsibility or blame to other people, and they're the only one accountable when they have all this information from other countries, or even from news, right? So they don't really act like proactively. And secondly, I want to also talk about this kind of how this kind of like restorative approach we're going to have much more happening under our side to shape behavior, right? We're talking about a lot of China saying being condemned about this kind of pandemic, but we say much more proactive measures can be seen under our side of the house when you see, for example, in side negative model, saying like Trump was stop funding the WHO, right? And we say actually it's much more important for us to say actually we're pushing this kind of narrative, like every country can be held accountable when you are not trying actively to stop this kind of pandemic to happen, which is the last time it's happened is like a century ago, right? So we want to stop this kind of massive pandemic, and therefore we say we were going to happening to push people to much more pay attention to these kind of health issues, which can have much more detrimental impact that we've never thought about in the previous centuries, and therefore I'm very proud to propose.
Thank you very much for that speech. Kindly reminder to not go over time. And without further ado, let's invite the first speaker from the negative team to deliver the speech.
I'm extremely sorry. Can I go to the bathroom real quick?
Very, very quick.
So sorry for the delay.
Sure, you can start whenever you're ready.
So this is a problem of the affirmative side's policy. They ask us to assume only the worst case scenario in which governments are always so malicious. Firstly, we told you that that's unlikely. But secondly, in the case in which that government is willing to forego all of the political domestic opposition against bad healthcare policies, why would that government have an incentive to cooperate and therefore change policies on your side of the bench when they have an alternative of hiding information from the international society and denying their wrongdoings, especially considering the fact that international courts are often extremely weak and are ineffective against the existence of the right of sovereignty of nations, which is why we think that in both case scenarios, they don't solve the pandemic effectively, and therefore we take the debate home. I'm going to be engaging with their best case scenario on that side of the bench in three areas. One, is their policy necessary? Second, how does their policy create change of incentives? And lastly, the principal part of the case which the government failed to engage in phase three. One, the necessity of this policy. The analysis we heard from the second affirmative is that governments are bad and don't care about the pandemic, and R&D happens only on their side of the bench. One, that argument would have been persuasive before the COVID-19 pandemic. After COVID-19 pandemic, we don't think that that's no longer true because as I explained to you, Trump's policies have failed and now he's changing his stance. We tell you before there was a narrative that pandemics only happen in developing nations where water supply is dirty and they don't have enough healthcare. Now we saw that pandemic can be a global and a massive issue, which is why if their policy is the government should do things like wash hands, why wouldn't the government do so when they recognize how important pandemics can be? But second, if you can fiat this policy, meaning that you can gather international countries to say that this is a crime against humanity, you have to reasonably assume that there's a growing concern about the international effects of pandemic on their side of the bench, which is symmetrical on our side of the bench as well, which means that there is a growing fiat and a growing political capital that is more concerned about pandemic on both sides of the house, which means that other regulations are likely to materialize on our side of the bench as well. The second thing they told you is that governments are making a concession in the status quo, and therefore this is bad. We don't think that dealing with the pandemic is that simple, because they have no analysis on why making no concession at all is the best thing to do. We tell you, for example, shutting down all companies and businesses, prosecuting anyone who leaves their home will be a super effective policy in dealing with pandemic. But we don't do that because there's cost to that, right? Things like massive unemployment leading to massive depression and repression actually leads to problems like suiciding of individuals. We gave you the example of first negative. When you reveal private information of sexual minorities, that can also be very devastating and impacting. Which is why we tell you, firstly, that accurately identifying what the right trade-off is extremely hard to do, which means that it's very likely that in retrospect, we might know what the answer is, but at that moment in time, it might be really hard to understand that, which is why we think that we can't put an unfair burden on governments. But second, accurately identifying the trade-off is extremely important. Before COVID-19, the problem was that the danger of COVID-19 pandemic was underrated. Right now, we are sensitive about that issue. We can correctly identify what the problem is, but the problem on that side of the house is that this will lead to disproportionate response that can lead to other social problems of severe overreaction of the problem, which is something that they heard no response whatsoever against. So I just don't think that this policy is that necessary and will lead to socially negative outcomes. Second, what kind of change of incentives does this policy lead to? So firstly, I want to explain to you why our arguments about perverse incentives will also equally apply to good governments as well. Because we told you at first negative that it's very likely for a government to misjudge the information or situation because the information about that pandemic is unavailable in many cases. Therefore, these decisions are extremely hard to make, and therefore mistakes can happen, and we think that that's just reasonably assumable. Which is why we think that when governments realize that they have made a misjudgment, then the incentive on that side of the bench is to hide that information. Because as we've explained to you, the standard of a clear trade-off and a good trade-off is extremely murky, and governments would not want to take the risk of being blamed as like a really bad government committing crimes against humanity. But second, in case we're talking about bad governments, which is the only case that their side was willing to engage upon, that government only cares about short-term incentives, things that pandemics are infrequent, things that this costs money, then they have an incentive to continue to do bad things, but rather try to hide and cover that up. Why do we think that this is bad? And why do we think that this response is extremely bad? One, when you hide that information, it leads to a lot of problems that both sides agreed upon. Their only mechanism on side affirmative in this debate was to tell you that their policy will lead to more investigation. Now look at how our policy towards China and forcing them to reveal investigation is oftentimes very ineffective because nations are offensively approaching this issue as a blame-shifting issue. Considering the fact that international courts are oftentimes historically insufficient and ineffective in overriding sovereignty of individuals, nations can simply override this international court and say that we're not willing to cooperate on that side of the bench. On our side of the bench, we can encourage things like cooperation, don't do blame shifting, so that their political and domestic incentive to solve the pandemic is now in line with the international response and the incentive we provide when we create a more hospitable environment on our side of the bench. Moreover, we told you that we have an incentive to demonize international organizations as well, because insofar as now, let's say that these courts blame that government for making a really bad mistake, and now they have nothing to lose in terms of international incentive because that court is already on progress. Which is why for domestic politicians to save face, their way is to demonize international institutions and say that they're oppressing them. Therefore, we think that it's just much harder to promote international cooperation. We think that this argument is especially more likely in developing nations, where oftentimes we tell you, hey, to a reasonable amount within their reasonable capacity, they have an incentive to promote for things like infrastructure and better healthcare. But in cases in which they can't do this perfectly, or probably cases where they don't have money, where they don't have the possibility to do so. And given that, therefore, we think that the degree in which they can promote proactive mechanisms are limited. We think that now, once given this inevitable situation, developing nations are likely to opt into hiding information or deny international cooperation, which we think is likely. And the third affirmative response about this doesn't cost money is just nonsense, because things like PPE, healthcare, R&D does cost money. Lastly, in terms of principle, so let's assume the best case scenario that good intent governments exist along with bad intent governments. Why do we think that still setting a law should be predicated upon the presumption of innocence? Because we tell you, insofar as there's a risk of unfairly penalizing a good government, the law shouldn't be trying to forego that possibility. That is why in the domestic criminal justice system, we have things like presumption of innocence, where even if we lose some criminals, we still presume the possibility of innocence, which is why we think that insofar as they didn't prove that every single government always does bad things and therefore leads to failure of dealing with the pandemic, they can't take this debate home. Because we clearly characterized to you that crimes against humanity is a severe and a very problematic issue, which means that equating this to things like using chemical weapons on your citizens and blaming these governments for doing these kind of stuff when they have tried to do good actions, but oftentimes made some mistakes, or in certain cases didn't have enough information and therefore made certain policies, is extremely unfair. So at the end of the day, let's assume that governments are bad. A, they don't have any engagement to our material about this leads to perverse incentives, how this becomes exponentially persuasive if governments are so bad. But B, they don't prove why the possibility of good governments existing is likely, especially given the increasing momentum due to the COVID-19 crisis we're very proud to oppose.
Thank you very much to the first speaker from the negative team. It's time for start reply speeches, and we will start from the negative team here whenever you're ready.
Am I audible? Two things in my speech. First of all, does government incentive really change in our worst case scenario as they want to characterize? Secondly, especially when we assume the best case scenario of government aggressively enforce policies that is like obviously going to prevent all the pandemic situation, is that really a good thing? First of all, government incentive change. I think basically their characterization is actually trying to actually only dealing with our worst case scenario, that government only thinking of themselves, like government, and because they actually have power imbalance thing, therefore they actually don't have any incentive to take care of their citizens. First of all, in our first negative speech, we already told you that things like re-election and things like political impetus, those mechanisms are already existing and already very powerful, especially when their example of Trump, I think even in the status quo, Trump is actually being worried of re-election, and Trump is actually trying to take a lot of active measures to deal with COVID-19 situation. But let's just be more charitable and only assume cases like Trump and China, where like they don't really care about the citizens at the end of the day. My question is, will they now have under their side of the house incentive to take care of their people and really protect the situation of pandemic? First of all, our second negative was very clear in terms of telling you as to why international organizations are not really powerful at the first place. They didn't really prove to us why those organizations are so powerful to the extent that international organizations actually can massively change the calculus of the government. Because we still see war crimes happening, even though international organizations really hate war crimes, right? Secondly, even if you assume they are so powerful to the extent that they can change the calculus, we told you that in second and third negative speech, because you don't want to be punished, there actually is more incentive to push blame upon other countries, right? This is reason as to why our first negative analysis as to why line is murky from the first place is very important, because from the moment when the line is murky, politicization and manipulation is very easy for those countries to actually utilize that and try to say that, hey, it is because you did not do certain things in order to protect the people. Secondly, we told you as to why hiding information, especially under the characterization of Trump and China, where they are so much obsessed with the economy, we tell you that because it costs a lot of money to enforce those kind of protection mechanisms, they are more likely to hide the information at the end of the day. So I think even in our worst case scenario, we tell you that those countries are actually going to have more malicious intention. Those countries are going to have more like legitimate political strategies that they can abuse upon. That's the reason why the outcome is going to get worse. Second thing is about their best case scenario where government aggressively enforce policies that is going to be protective. First of all, we told you that there actually is a cost that is entailed upon those protection policies. We told you as to why economy is going to get bad. As also, we told you why individual rights can be possibly deteriorated. In terms of the economy, we cannot really precisely in accurate case how that economic regulation is going to impact the individuals and impact the whole economy at the end of the day. And also in terms of individual rights, I think revealing that a certain place was a gay bar and revealing the track of information, track of the places that gay people had actually went. We told you that in first negative speech that this actually harms individual identity. This actually going to lead to more massive discrimination. That's actually going to be existential threats upon those kind of individuals. No response from their side as well. So they didn't really prove to us why all those kind of harms can be outweighed over the benefits that they can actually do in terms of things like PPE or all. Our second thing was about developing countries. They talk about proactive measures. First of all, we told you that they are just incapable of doing that, which means that the cost that they actually have to bear of those kind of proactive policies is much bigger under the case of developing countries means that they actually have to bear all the costs to a much larger degree. Secondly, we told you as to why there is an incentive for those developing countries to opt into hiding information as well, which means that the cooperation between the international community is also likely to happen more than how supposed.
Thank you very much for that speech. And it's time for the last speech of this quarterfinal. We would like to invite the reply speaker from the affirmative side.
Hi, am I audible? Am I being clear?
Yes, all clear.
Oh, okay. Good. Just a second. Panels within the negative thing has been very uncomparative when when they only want to talk about this kind of good government and also talking about those kind of individual rights. We don't understand why those kind of issues matter, especially when we're telling you this kind of good government, if they do really exist. For example, countries like South Korea, New Zealand, we don't see how they're going to be targeted in the first place, right? But secondly, they also tell you that this kind of individual rights are going to be targeted. Firstly, we don't see how this kind of individual information will be revealed in the first place. But secondly, we tell you that this kind of issue is not mutually exclusive. It also exists in their side when those kind of blames has already happening. But lastly, we also felt like this kind of fault is this kind of blame is the fault of this kind of homophobic country instead of ICC themselves, right? But more importantly, we think that this debate is more about two issues. Firstly, about whether it's fair to include this kind of failure to the crimes against humanity. But secondly, how this kind of measures can actually be taken place and why the measures in the status quo are actually not enough in their side of the house, right? So firstly, the way I want to tell you, what they actually want to prove on the issue of how this kind of how this kind of countries have this kind of good intention, we tell you that firstly they have never proved to you why this kind of good intention exists in the first place, right? Especially when we see that China actually want more social stability and continuously actively censor those kind of dissent coming from the social medias, right? But secondly, we give you even if we give you the benefit of the doubt, especially established in my second speaker, we tell you that even if this kind of good intention do exist, there's no linkage coming from negative that prove to us how this kind of good intention that cares about economic prosperity that in favor of the people, right? Especially when we tell you that this kind of government, for example, United States, actually care more about re-election and care about economic reopening that outweighs the kind of social distancing and also to wear the mask in their paradigm, right? We think that they have never proved to you why this kind of malicious politicians do exist and why it is still enough for them to do that, right? But secondly, we tell that when they want to challenge on our mechanism by telling us those kind of small countries should be prevented simply because they do not have the capability of doing so. Firstly, we have already tell you that what kind of issue will be included into our investigation and make sure that it's fair. But secondly, we also felt like these kind of small countries do exist, and they actually have the capability to seek for international help, especially when they have the information when those kind of coronavirus is actually coming in, right? We think that measures, and also we tell you that these kind of measures like social distancing and the wearing mask doesn't really cost much. That costs a lot of money, right? We think that they have the full capability of doing so at the end of the day. But secondly, they also tell that national government will be more incentivized to cover up. Two responses to that, right? First, we have already tell you this kind of cover exists in both sides anyway, right? But secondly, we also tell you that this kind of pandemic, the exclusiveness of this kind of pandemic is that they will spread no matter how no matter the cover up exists or not, right? For example, we see that China aggressively want to cover up this kind of information, but pandemic still spread to other countries, no matter the border or not, right? We think that actually provides a ways for us to identify how people are actually dying, and also how this kind of issues of failures of national government do exist, and they cannot simply ignore on their side of the house. But also, they say that it is going to incite hatred and politicization and things like that. Firstly, we tell you that this kind of issues are always not mutually exclusive, and also especially when we see that this kind of fault on this kind of fault blaming has already happening. But secondly, what's that it is more unlikely to happen? Why? Because we see that the issue of the pandemic is that people see that people are dying around them. People see the impact of that. It is more likely for people to witness the benefits of this kind of investigation instead of simply blaming other governments, right? We think that it is more likely this kind of investigation to be impartial and for us to actually have this kind of transparency and more check and balance in the long term. Very proud to
silent round of